Good evening, or morning, or, whatever time it happens to be right now. I'm your imaginary friend, and tonight, or today, or this morning, or whatever, I'd like to read to you a story by Villiers de la Ile Adam called Torture by Hope. Now, you, my imaginary friends, may have heard me on several occasions invoke Luke Westaway's dire warning that sometimes the real horror is Victorian attitudes to race, color, creed, sexual orientation, pretty much anything. And in this case, we have a Victorian horror story about the Spanish Inquisition, where the main character is Jewish. So brace yourself a little for Torture by Hope. Below the vault of the official of Saragossa, one nightfall long ago, the venerable Pedro Arbuez de Espilla, sixth prior of the Dominicans of Segovia, third Grand Inquisitor of Spain, followed by a Fra Redemptor, master torturer, and preceded by two familiars of the Holy Office holding lanterns, descended towards a secret dungeon. The lock of a massive door creaked. They entered a stifling in pace, where the little light that came from above revealed an instrument of torture blackened with blood, a chafing dish, and a pitcher. Fastened to the wall by heavy iron rings, on a mass of filthy straw secured by fetters, an iron circlet about his neck, sat a man in rags. It was impossible to guess at his age. This prisoner was no other than Rabbi Aser Abarbanel, a Jew of Aragon, who, on an accusation of usury and pitiless contempt of the poor, had for more than a year undergone daily torture. In spite of all, his blind obstinacy being as tough as his skin, he had refused to abjure. Proud of his descent and his ancestors, for all Jews worthy of the name are jealous of their race, he was descended, according to the Talmud, from Othoniel, and consequently from Ipsibo, wife of this last judge of Israel, a circumstance which sustained his courage under the severest of the incessant tortures. It was, then, with tears in his eyes that the thought that so steadfast a soul was excluded from salvation, that the venerable Pedro Arbuez de Espilla, approaching the quivering rabbi, pronounced the following words: "My son, be of good cheer. Your trials here below are about to cease. If in presence of such obstinacy I've had to permit, though with sighs, the employment of severe measures, my task of paternal correction has its limits. You are the barren fig tree that, found so oft without fruit, incurs the danger of being dried up by the roots. But it is for God alone to decree concerning your soul. Perhaps the infinite mercy will shine upon you at the last moment. Let us hope so. There are instances. May it be so. Sleep, then, this evening in peace. Tomorrow you will take part in the auto de fe. That is to say, you will be exposed to the quamadero, the brazier premonitory of the eternal flame. It burns, you are aware, at a certain distance, my son, and death takes, in coming, 2 hours at least, often 3, thanks to the moistened and frozen clothes with which we take care to preserve the forehead and the heart of the holocausts. You will be only 43. Consider then that, placed in the last rank, you will have the time needful to invoke God, to offer unto him that baptism of fire which is of the Holy Spirit. Hope then in the light, and sleep." As he ended this discourse, Dom Arbuez, who had motioned the wretched man's fetters to be removed, embraced him tenderly. Then came the turn of the Fra Redemptor, who in a low voice prayed the Jew to pardon what he had made him endure in the effort to redeem him. Then the two familiars clasped him in their arms. Their kiss through their cowls was unheard. The ceremony at an end, the captive was left alone in the darkness. Rabbi Aser Abarbanel, his lips parched, his face stupefied by suffering, stared without any particular attention at the closed door. Closed. The word, half unknown to himself, awoke a strange delusion in his confused thoughts. He fancied he had seen, for 1 second, the light of the lanterns through the fissure between the sides of the door. A morbid idea of hope, due to the enfeeblement of his brain, took hold on him. He dragged himself towards this strange thing he had seen, and slowly inserting a finger with infinite precautions into the crack, he pulled the door toward him. Wonder of wonders! By some extraordinary chance, the familiar who had closed it had turned the great key a little before it had closed upon its jambs of stone, so the rusty bolt not having entered its socket, the door rolled back into the cell. The rabbi ventured to look out. By means of a livid obscurity, he distinguished, first of all, a half-circle of earthy walls, pierced by spiral stairways, and opposite to him 5 or 6 stone steps, dominated by a sort of black porch, giving access to a vast corridor of which he could only see from below the nearest arches. Stretching himself along, he crawled to the level of this threshold. Yes, it was indeed a corridor, but of boundless length. A faint light, a sort of dream light, was cast over it, lamps suspended to the arched roof, turned by intervals the wan air blue. The far distance was lost in shadow. Not a door visible along all this length. On one side only, to the left, small holes covered with a network of bars let a feeble twilight through the depths of the wall. The light of sunset, apparently, for red gleams fell at long intervals on the flagstones. And how fearful a silence! Yet there in the depths of the dim distance, the way might lead to liberty. The wavering hope of the Jew was dogged, for it was the last. Without hesitation, he ventured forth, keeping close to the side of the light holes, hoping to render himself indistinguishable from the darksome color of the long walls. He advanced slowly, dragging himself along the ground, forcing himself not to cry out when one of his wounds, recently opened, sent a sharp pang through him. All of a sudden, the beat of a sandal, coming in his direction, echoed along the stone passage. A trembling fit seized him. He choked with anguish. His sight grew dim. So this, no doubt, was to be the end. He squeezed himself, doubled up on his hands and knees, into a recess, and half dead with terror, waited. It was a familiar, hurrying along. He passed rapidly, carrying an instrument for tearing out the muscles. His cowl lowered, he disappeared. The violent shock which the rabbi had received had half suspended the functions of life. He remained for nearly an hour, unable to make a single movement. In the fear of an increase of torments if he were caught, the idea came to him of returning to his cell. But the old hope chirped in his soul, the divine perhaps, the comforter in the worst of distresses. A miracle had taken place. There was no more room for doubt. He began again to crawl toward the possible escape. Worn out with suffering and with hunger, trembling with anguish, he advanced. And he, never ceasing his slow advance, gazed forward through the darkness, on, where there must be an outlet that would save him. But oh, steps sounding again. Steps, this time slower, more somber. The forms of 2 inquisitors, robed in black and white, and wearing their large hats with rounded brims, emerged into the faint light. They talked in low voices and seemed to be in controversy on some important point, for their hands gesticulated. At this sight, Rabbi Yasser Abarbanel closed his eyes. His heart beat as if it would kill him. His rags were drenched with the cold sweat of agony. Motionless, gasping, he lay stretched along the wall, under the light of one of the lamps, motionless, imploring the God of David. As they came opposite to him, the two inquisitors stopped under the light of the lamp. Through a mere chance, no doubt, in their discussion, one of them, listening to his interlocutor, looked straight at the rabbi. Under this gaze, of which he did not at first notice the vacant expression, the wretched man seemed to feel the hot pincers biting into his poor flesh. So he was again to become a living wound, a living woe. Fainting, scarce able to breathe, his eyelids quivering, he shuddered as the robe grazed him. But, strange at once and natural, the eyes of the inquisitor were evidently the eyes of a man profoundly preoccupied with what he was going to say in reply. Absorbed by what he was listening to, they were fixed and seemed to be looking at the Jew without seeing him. And indeed, in a few minutes, the two sinister talkers went on their way, slowly, still speaking in low voices, in the direction from which the prisoner had come. They had not seen him. And it was so that in the horrible disarray of his sensations, his brain was traversed by this thought: am I already dead, so that no one sees me? A hideous impression drew him from his lethargy. On gazing at the wall, exactly opposite to his face, he fancied he saw, over against his, two ferocious eyes observing him. He flung back his head in a blind and sudden terror. The hair started upright on his head. But no. He put out his hand and felt along the stones. What he saw was the reflection of the eyes of the inquisitor still left upon his pupils, and which he had refracted upon two spots on the wall. Forward. He must hasten toward that end that he imagined, fondly no doubt, to mean deliverance, towards those shadows from which he was no more than 30 paces or so distant. He started once more, crawling on hands and knees and stomach upon his dolorous way, and he was soon within the dark part of the fearful corridor. All at once the wretched man felt the sensation of cold upon his hands that he placed on the flagstones. It was a strong current which came from under a little door at the end of the passage. Oh God, if this door opened on the outer world! The whole being of the poor prisoner was overcome by a sort of vertigo of hope. He examined the door from top to bottom, without being able to distinguish it completely on account of the dimness around him. He felt over it. No lock, not a bolt, a latch! He rose to his feet. The latch yielded beneath his finger. The silent door opened before him. Alleluia, murmured the rabbi, in an immense sigh, as he gazed at what stood revealed to him from the threshold. The door opened upon gardens, upon a night of stars, upon spring, liberty, life. The gardens gave access to the neighboring country that stretched away to the Sierras, whose sinuous white lines stood out in profile on the horizon. There lay liberty. Oh, to fly! He would run all night under those woods of citrons whose perfume intoxicated him. Once among the mountains, he would be saved. He breathed the dear, holy air. The wind reanimated him. His lungs found free play. He heard in his expanding heart, the Lazarus, come forth. And to give thanks to God, who had granted him this mercy, he stretched forth his arms before him, lifting his eyes to the firmament in an ecstasy And then he seemed to see the shadow of his arms returning upon himself. He seemed to feel those shadow arms surround, enlace him, and himself pressed tenderly against some breast. A tall figure indeed was opposite to him. Confidently, he lowered his eyes upon this figure and remained gasping, stupefied, with staring eyes and mouth driveling with fright. Horror! He was in the arms of the Grand Inquisitor himself, the venerable Pedro Arbuez de Espilla, who gazed at him with eyes full of tears, like a good shepherd who has found the lost sheep. The sombre priest clasped the wretched Jew against his heart with so fervent a transport of charity that the points of the monocle haircloth rasped against the chest of the Dominican. And while the Rabbi Aser Abarbanel, his eyes convulsed beneath his eyelids, choked with anguish between the arms of the ascetic Dom Arbuez, realizing confusedly that all the phases of the false evening had only been a calculated torture, that of hope. The Grand Inquisitor, with a look of distress, an accent of poignant reproach, murmured in his ear, with the burning breath of much fasting, "What, my child, on the eve, perhaps, of salvation, you would then leave us?"